I'm not an expert on climate change and the press. Bob Ward gave a very interesting talk on Monday because he's been studying this for a lot longer than I have. But I have been looking at it in a rather amateur way, and there are 4 ways which I've identified in which one can judge what the press are up to. Now, firstly, I want to deal with the Murdoch press, the Sunday Times, the Times and the Sun. There is absolutely no question that their coverage is severely biased on the side of climate change contrarians. The Times in particular publishes scientifically illiterate articles by the likes of Matt Ridley, and then refuses to publish letters from myself or other readers trying to correct some of the more glaring errors in the original articles. I have actually reported the Times to the Press Complaints Commission in relation to 2 specific articles written by Matt Ridley. The first was published in August 2010, and it was a very one-sided attack on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and was entitled, "This Discredited Science Body Must Be Purged." The second was an article published on 1st of November 2011 entitled, "7 billion people is nothing to worry about." And this article contained the extraordinary statement that humanity's carbon footprint can be successfully managed by converting from one fossil fuel to another. In other words, by converting from coal to shale gas. And of course, it was Matt Ridley who wrote the report for Nigel Lawson's think tank, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, entitled "The Shale Gas Shock," in which they publish a sort of uncritical eulogy about the benefits of shale gas. It also contained the extraordinary statement that if the world's population rose to 9 billion, which it's scheduled to do by 2050, this could be easily managed. My letters to the letters editor pointed out that annual emissions of CO2 have risen by 49%, the baseline year since 1990, the baseline year for Kyoto, and that in order to avoid irreversible climate change, atmospheric levels of CO2 should not rise above 450 parts per million, and in order to achieve this, the carbon output per capita worldwide would have to fall to a mean of 0.3 tons of carbon per person per year. The level in the United States is about 6. So the average carbon output per head of population in the States would have to fall by a reduction of 20-fold. I didn't think this could be achieved by converting from coal to shale gas. The other problem with shale gas, of course, is that it releases large amounts of methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas, 7 times more powerful than CO2 over a 20-year time frame. And unless methane emissions from fracking are kept below 2%, then shale gas is as bad as coal in terms of its greenhouse effect. Currently, fracking operations run around 7 to 10% of fugitive emissions, as they're called, and the fossil fuel industry in America is making strenuous efforts to resist legislation by the Environmental Protection Agency to reduce methane emissions from fracking. Technology could, of course, reduce emissions to below 2%, but then, of course, shale gas would no longer be competitive in comparison with other fossil fuels and would also lose its price advantage over renewables. The complaint to the PCC was also predicated on the first article, which is basically a vindictive and biased critique of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I don't want to get into this in too much detail because it's not really worth it. Just to say that the IPCC, after they had produced their 4th report in 2007, on which they were criticised for erroneous comment they made about the Himalayan glaciers, they invited the Inter-Academy Council, the IAC, which is a very prestigious worldwide body, to review their processes in order to improve matters before they produced their 5th report. The IAC is a very prestigious body, and they made a few criticisms of the IPCC, of which the most trenchant was the statement, they, the IPCC, have made some statements for which there is little evidence. When Matt Ridley wrote his piece for the Times, he changed this to, they produced statements for which there was very little evidence. So he actually misquoted the IAC in order to bolster his own case. Even the Times has accepted that that is unacceptable. However, I'm not very optimistic about the results of my reporting the Times to the PCC, because Bob Ward told me that he had done exactly the same thing over an article which had been published in another national newspaper which claimed that there had been no sea level rises. And that is blatantly untrue, but his complaint was not upheld because the article had quoted a scientist who believed that there was no sea level rises, or who had argued there was no sea level rises, and the judgment from the PCC was, as long as that scientist was accurately quoted, then the newspaper had fulfilled its duty not to publish misleading or inaccurate information. Bob Ward also reported Channel 4 to the PCC for that appalling film called The Great Climate Change Swindle that was broadcast a few years ago, which was so full of errors it's difficult to know where to start. And he thought, surely this cannot be allowed because it is clearly misleading and inaccurate. But the judgment from the PCC was that the stricture about being accurate only applied to news programs, not to documentaries. Oh, where's that come from? Oh, sorry, that's right, okay. The second way of assessing press coverage of climate change is to examine the amount of column inches that were devoted to the issue of climate change at the time of the United Nations conference in Durban, South Africa in December of last year. The conference was supposed to finish on the Friday, but there was all sorts of arguments going on. It actually ran on until the Sunday. So I bought all the newspapers that mattered all the way through from Thursday the 9th to the 12th of December, which was the Monday after the conference actually finished, on the basis that if ever the press in this country were going to cover the issue of climate change, that would be the time that they actually did it. And as you can see, yes, the other thing was, at the same time, there was quite a lot of financial turmoil in Europe, and David Cameron elected not to sign the new European financial agreement, so Britain was the only one that was left out of the European agreement. So I therefore compared the amount of column inches devoted to climate change with the amount of column inches devoted to financial matters. I left out colour supplements. You'll see from this chart that none of the papers in the UK devoted more than 2% of their space to climate change, yet they devoted between 5 and 12% to the issue of the economy. The average figures were 1.3% for climate change and 7.4% for the economy, a ratio of almost 6 to 1. Personally, I think the press got this the wrong way round. As Colin Worth prophetically said, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. One more insight into the newspapers I surveyed. The Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday, which of course are two of the main organs of climate change contrarianism since Nigel Lawson had lunch with Paul Dacre in 2010, they had the lowest percent of column inches devoted to climate change, just 0.7%, and most of it was irredeemably hostile. Over the same period, these same newspapers devoted 3% of their coverage to medical matters and 0.6% of their column inches, the same as climate change, to cosmetic dermatology. Now, I've spent most of my adult life practicing dermatology. It never occurred to me that cosmetic creams and facelifts demanded the same attention in the firmament of man's destiny as climate change. The third way to monitor press and climate change is my own experience trying to get letters published. Overall, I've had about 122 letters or articles published in national newspapers since I got involved in environmental issues at the beginning of the 80s. From 1980 to 1990, I had 17 letters or articles published in the Times newspapers, mainly on the subject of lead in petrol or ionising radiation. Since 1990, I've had about 43 letters or articles published on global warming. 24 of these were published in the Times, and the majority of these were first letters. And the ratio of writing a letter to getting it published in the Times was about 2 to 1. Since November 2011, I or my co-workers have written 25 letters to the Times, the FT or the Sunday Times, and of these only 4 have been published, ratio of worse than 6 to 1. So something is different nowadays, and I suspect that many of these letters were refused because these newspapers exercise prejudicial coverage of the climate change issue. Of course, Telegraph newspapers are even worse. I've never had a single letter published on global warming by the Telegraph ever. The fourth way of looking at press and climate change is to look across the pond to see what is going on in America. As you know, Fox News is also owned by Rupert Murdoch, and there's absolutely no doubt their coverage of climate change issue is grossly biased, and in fact they hardly make any attempt to deny this, and have actually said on air they're not interested in discussing the facts. Rick Santorum, who was the favoured presidential nomination by Rupert Murdoch, announced recently that he should get the Republican nomination because he was the first candidate to realise that climate change was a hoax. A detailed analysis by a team of academics published in the International Journal of Press and Politics demonstrated that by comparison with CNN and NBC, Fox News is distorting and perverting the climate change debate and is having a significant negative impact on public opinion and hence government policy. To quote, there was a very clear pattern. Although Fox discussed climate change most often, the tone of its coverage was disproportionately dismissive. The dismissiveness was present in almost every category. A third of Fox's broadcasts rejected the reality of climate change, while only 21% accepted it. No other network came close to these figures. Almost 4 times as many broadcasts on Fox claimed there was no consensus as accepted that one existed. The opposite was true of the other networks. Furthermore, a survey carried out by the Farley Dickinson University demonstrated that Fox News viewers are less well informed than people who don't watch any news at all. Of course, this would all be hilarious were it not for the fact that virtually every Republican candidate for the US presidency is a climate change denier. Witness Rick Perry, the governor of Texas, whose state had wildfires because of drought, and he was actually criticized by Obama for his stance on climate change, saying a governor whose state is on fire denying climate change as an exemplification of the weakness of the Republican presidential field. So basically, Fox News is a propaganda channel for Murdoch in the United States that pollutes the climate change debate. One can only guess at the motivation of Murdoch and his henchmen. However, I concluded my complaint to the PCC as follows. In America, 2/3 of the US population believe that global warming is a conspiracy dreamt up by climate change scientists to further their own research budgets. This can only be described as a mass delusion which has been largely fostered and perpetuated by Fox News, owned of course by NewsCorp. In this country, the Times, and previously the Financial Times, is owned by the same outfit, and their pursuit of the truth is best illustrated by the performance of James Murdoch in front of the Select Committee for Culture, Media and Sport on November the 10th, 2011. I think that the Murdoch, through their publications in the UK, exert a pernicious and perverting influence on the scientific debate about the causes and dangers of global warming. I believe that your committee should censor them severely for their failure to present legitimate counter-arguments in their letters columns. They were going to let me have a verdict last week, but for some reason it's been delayed, probably because Murdoch's been getting a very bad press recently. Finally, there are 2 very worrying developments. As a result of activities of the oil lobby, Fox News and right-wing politicians in the United States, President Obama has been persuaded that shale gas is the way forward for the United States. In his State of the Union address this year, which was January the 24th, 2012, Obama said, "We have a supply of natural gas that can last America nearly 100 years. My administration will take every possible action to safely develop this energy. Experts believe this will support more than 600,000 jobs by the end of the decade." He's talking, of course, about shale gas. The development of natural gas will create jobs and power trucks. The development of natural gas will create jobs and power trucks and factories that are cleaner and cheaper. As I've said, shale gas is only cheaper if you control the fugitive emissions, proving that we don't have to choose between our environment and our economy. The United States, of course, is trying to make itself energy independent, and they see shale gas as the way forward. I don't want to get too involved in this because we've discussed it elsewhere during the conference, but there is a well-coordinated campaign in America, fortified by every right-wing pundit, to promote the use of shale gas and nuclear over energy conservation and renewables. In this country, the main protagonist for the climate change contrarians is Nigel Lawson and his shadowy think tank, the Global Warming Policy Foundation. According to Lawson, this organisation was set up in 2009 because of the ClimateGate fiasco, whereby persons unknown, though they were from the eastern United States, hacked into the emails of the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia. These were released just before the Copenhagen summit in a deliberate attempt to undermine the credibility of the science of global warming. So to quote Lawson, at the launch of his Global Warming Foundation, it is against all this background that I am announcing today the launch of a new high-powered all-party and non-party think tank, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which I hope may mark a turning point in the political and public debate on the important issue of global warming policy. Well, he was right there. Since his launch, there have been 5 official inquiries into ClimateGate, 3 in the United Kingdom, and 2 in America. And not a single one has found any evidence of any scientific misconduct. So I asked Lawson in an email, since the scientists from East Anglia have now all been officially exonerated, why don't you shut down GWPF? He didn't answer, but you can read the email correspondence outside. Lawson's think tank does not pretend to be a scientific committee. The trustees, who have an average age of 74, do not contain a single scientist. Indeed, Lawson is on record as saying, we will certainly be involved in monitoring what is being said, in correcting errors where there are errors. The only thing we will not be actively engaged in is what are the causes of the temperature changes on the planet. How much is CO2? How much is solar radiation? How much is cosmic rays? We won't be getting into all that. Well, won't be getting into all that. Very wise if you're not a scientist, but hardly reassuring. He goes on. I have no idea whether the major scientific view, and it is far from a consensus, is correct. Certainly it is curious that whereas their models, that's the IPCC, predicted an acceleration in global warming this century as the growth in emissions accelerated, so far this century there has been no further warming at all. This graph shows the temperature changes every decade since 1950, and you can see it's gone up every year, and the increase in from 2000 to 2010 is actually slightly greater than it was from 1990 to 2000. So Lawson is what in Wales we call a big fat fibber. So what is Lawson up to? Well, firstly, he's heavily into shale gas. His Global Warming Policy Foundation issued a major report in April 2011 entitled The Shale Gas Shock. This was basically an undisguised eulogy extolling the virtues of shale gas and written by, as I've said, our friend Matt Ridley. Lawson also runs an investment house in Oxford called the Oxford Investment Partnership on behalf of 5 Oxford colleges, St Catherine, St John's, New College, Christchurch and Balliol. The OXIP is chaired by Lawson, and apparently and perhaps incredibly they have no ethical policy. I talked to the bursar of New College, David Palfreman, who's a trustee of OXIP, and he told me we do not allow ethical considerations to distort our investment strategy. That's pretty clear. He also told me he doesn't believe in global warming. What newspaper do you read? I said. The Telegraph? No, he said, the Financial Times. So, of course, the poor bursar has to listen to Matt Ridley, who's a fellow of New College. He has the FT in the morning, Lawson over lunch, and Ridley for dinner. What a terrible combination. I've not been able to discover the extent to which OXIP invests in shale gas and tar sands, but I do know that Towers Watson are advisors to OXIP, and Tower Watson have a huge presence in Canada. Canada, you may recall, has the biggest tar sand deposits anywhere in the world, and has also pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol so that they can develop their fossil fuel reserves without incurring any financial penalties from the world community. Indeed, when their Foreign Minister Peter Kent announced after the Durban summit that Canada was withdrawing from Kyoto, he boasted it would save Canada an $8 billion fine. As an ex-Tory Chancellor, Lawson, of course, also has the ear of George Osborne. It is no coincidence that in his budget statement on March 21st, Osborne announced, "Gas is cheap, has much less carbon than coal, and will be the largest single source of our electricity in the coming years." He also said, "Renewable energy will play a crucial part in Britain's energy mix." It certainly doesn't yet, less than 4%, but I will always be alert to the costs we are asking families and businesses to bear. Doesn't seem to apply to nuclear, does it? Environmentally sustainable has to be fiscally sustainable too. Another rabid climate change contrarian is Christopher Booker of the Sunday Telegraph, who writes a column every week, and this is almost invariably designed to sow disinformation about climate change. On Sunday, April the 15th, Mr. Booker wrote an article which completely misrepresented an article on climate change that had been published in Nature the previous week. The article was entitled, "In the Eyes of Nature, Warming Cannot Be Natural." I wrote to the letter's editor as follows: "Amongst all the heat and furore generated by the climate change contrarians, one fact stands out like a beacon. Christopher Booker is no scientist. His article states, when the Earth was emerging from the last ice age 15,000 years ago, it was temperatures that rose first, later followed by rises in CO2. This, of course, is the exact opposite of the article published in Nature, whose title reads, "Global warming preceded by increasing carbon dioxide concentrations during the last deglaciation." I'm not sure if Mr. Booker has a scientific credential to his name, but if he failed his physics O-level, it's not hard to see why. Needless to say, this letter was not published. I want to finish by quoting a letter in The Guardian by Dr. Fiona Godley, who was editor of the BMJ, British Medical Journal, and Dr. Richard Horton, who was editor of The Lancet, and 6 other doctors. In response to an article about Lawson and his Global Warming Policy Foundation, they wrote as follows on January the 24th, 2012. "Denying the link between greenhouse gas emissions and man-made climate change is akin to denying the link between HIV/AIDS and unprotected sex, smoking and lung cancer, or alcohol consumption and liver disease. In each of these cases, well-funded deniers have had to be exposed and confronted before appropriate health-promoting legislation was put in place." And they went on, "Transparency around climate change, about climate skeptic funders is essential. We support freedom of information to reveal those deliberately preventing the UK's sustainable future." I wrote a letter to the Daily Telegraph about this, as they had published 2 eulogies about Nigel Lawson the week before. One was saying what a wonderful family man he was, and the other was saying, why do mistresses find men over 80 attractive? They seem to be slightly contradictory. So I wrote, "The Daily Telegraph seems to be in the business of resurrecting the reputations of former chancellors. We know that Nigel Lawson has the ear of the current Chancellor, George Osborne, but we still have no idea who funds Lawson's shadowy think tank, the Global Warming Policy Foundation." Needless to say, this letter wasn't published either. However, we now know, thanks to Guardian Online, March 28th, that the person funding Lawson's shadowy think tank is a hedge fund manager who speculates on the price of oil. Michael Hintzer is a major Tory party donor. He's given £2.5 million to date and has, of course, paid for dinner engagements with Dave Cameron. The EU has a proposal to ban speculation in the price of oil. And which do you think is the only country in the EU that is opposing this proposal? Indeed, it is the UK. Now, isn't that a coincidence? Corruption, greed and power. It's a powerful combination, and that is what we are up against. Thank you very much.
Good. much more amusing to the reader to read a report of a dispute and some extreme statements on either side of the case. What do you think is the answer? How do you think it's possible to take the excitement of disputation out of these newspaper reports and encourage them to do something more objective?
That's a very good question. I mean, Chris Rapley, who was head of the Science Museum, talked about this on Wednesday, and they had done an analysis and they found that about 12% of people were extremely concerned about climate change and were prepared to speak out openly about it. And 13%, and that 12% were extremely concerned about people believing that climate change happened, and I don't know if they were worried about the financial consequences of doing something about it. So there were about an equal number of people who were denying it and promoting it. But of course the deniers have been much more effective because they have taken a very small mistake in the climate change case. Firstly, ClimateGate, and then secondly, the mistake about the date that the Himalayan glaciers would melt. And they have repeated it over and over and over again. And if, in campaigning terms, if you want to get your message across, the way to do it is to take a few simple facts and just keep repeating them. And then eventually the press start publicising it. Whereas the people who are concerned about climate change have got such a wealth of information on their side, they don't know where to start. You have, I mean, and for them to be more effective, you have to hone down on a few key facts, like if the Greenland ice sheet melts, world sea levels will go up 7 meters, that sort of fact. And you stick to that, you keep repeating that, and then eventually the press will get the message. So that is the way to counter the disinformation that's been coming from the contrarian side.
Robin, it's all very, very interesting, and I enjoy your presentation. But what concerns me is how we are going to rebalance this equation, because it's all operating against our cause at the moment, as I see it. And I just think that on the denial side, they seem capable of producing very little scientific information that justifies their case. And I think there is far too much a case for people believing that it's the natural cycle of events and it's going to happen and we're going to have a global warming and we're going to have another ice age and so on and so forth, and not really prepared to accept the link between the way we behave and carbon emissions. You know how I feel about it. I would like to find a way of getting far better influence with the press than we're able to achieve at the moment. And I don't know how to do it. And with greatest respect, you don't know how to do it either, because it's not happening. I think we've got to persevere, haven't we? It's not a question, really.
No.
But you know, what worries me is when I talk to my 3 children, and their attitude is almost, well, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. And there are far too many people thinking that way. And somehow we need to get the message across that it actually is happening in their lifetime as we speak.
Yeah. Well, what part of the problem is the BBC. I mean, I don't particularly want to mention them in the same category as NewsCorp and the Telegraph, but the BBC have had a problem with climate change because a few years ago they were criticised by Lawson for being too climate change friendly. And they conducted a review, and they got Steve Jones, Professor Steve Jones from Imperial College, to conduct the review. And of course it slightly backfired on Lawson, because Steve Jones concluded that the BBC were actually presenting the science as if there was a debate, whereas in fact there wasn't a debate, and that they ought to be far more proactive in presenting the science and stop talking to the flat earthers, basically. But of course they got something wrong in the report. They attributed a quote to Lawson which he hadn't made, and he got Carter Ruck to serve an injunction on them, and it's basically neutralised them. So the BBC are very wary of touching the climate change issue. They just think it's too hot to handle, and that is a problem. But they'll get there eventually, they're bound to. I mean, you can't go on denying the science forever. I mean, I know the Catholic Church did. I mean, the Catholic Church didn't accept that Galileo was right until 1992. But I think the BBC will move a bit quicker than that.
Well, when you're looking for some key facts, that's going to, well, worth repeating over and over.
Yeah.
The Iceland ice cap melting isn't one of them. That's an if.
No, that's going to happen. That is going to happen.
What the contrarians are doing are using current evidence and saying that that's not the case because what's the current evidence for climate change happening now rather than the ice cap melting in prospect? What are our 4 things we've got to mention to the press over?
Well, CO2 levels are going up, temperature levels are going up, sea levels are rising, and the Greenland ice cap is fraying around the edges. So, I mean, those are the 4 key facts that are undeniable. Plus, every serious scientist in the world, plus every reputable scientific journal, is agreed on climate change. There is a total scientific consensus. All that Lawson doesn't challenge the science. He's not stupid. What he does is he finds a small mistake in the science and he hammers that again and again, as if that in some way invalidates the whole corpus of knowledge that has been accumulated about climate change over the last 50 years. That's what he does. And of course, he doesn't operate at a scientific level. He wouldn't come to this conference because he suddenly realised there were people in the audience who knew what they were talking about. Well, that's the last thing he wants. He operates at the political level. He talks to journalists and he talks to politicians who are scientifically illiterate. So he can get away with his particular brand of bullshit. But he wouldn't get away with it in this sort of audience, not for a second. It's the ultimate example of the old boy network.
So, in order to work in the same effective manner as the contrarians, should you use less science to the general public?
No, you have to use the science. If you don't stand on the science, you're standing on nothing. So you have to establish your key scientific facts, and then you stand on those facts, and then you fight your campaign.
Yeah, agreed. But when you repeat your message to the public,
yeah.
Avoid putting science in it, but it is scientifically backed, whatever you are saying.
Yeah, you have.
Keep it in English.
Yeah, you must never say anything you can't back up scientifically,
yeah.
Otherwise you're lost. You immediately are discredited and they will jump all over you. So you have always to stick to the science. The science is the bedrock of any campaign. And, you know, if you have a decent fact, it's like a pickaxe with a diamond tip. You just keep tapping away at the opposition, and you just keep tapping away, and first of all they don't respond to you, they ignore you, then they think they've got to say something, but what they say is wrong, so then they change their mind and say something else, and you keep tapping away, and then the press realise that they're confused, and then the edifice starts to weaken, and then it starts to crumble, and the whole thing comes crashing down. It doesn't matter how big or how mighty the industry, they come crashing down if you use the facts, eventually. But in this particular campaign, we haven't got very long.
When you did your research on who's going to speak at this conference, I was wondering, did you come across anybody who might be considered a celebrity, who could be a spokesperson for the case? So they don't have to be an expert. It could be the equivalent of Bono of U2 for the Make Poverty History campaign. We just need somebody who's iconic in a way, who's engaged sufficiently to come out and say your 4 key facts,
yeah.
and stated, and they will be accepted because of who they are as much as the science of it. Is any person or group of people who you could say could be a spokesman that way or represent?
Well, I worked very, very hard on getting Vivienne Westwood to come. I mean, she ummed and ahed for some time and then eventually decided not to come, and I don't understand why, because it seems to me that our goals are identical. I mean, her main concern is the Amazonian rainforest, and she's launched an organisation called Cool Earth in order to campaign to protect the Amazon. But, you know, they're not different. I mean, you know, the Amazon is crucial to global warming because it is a huge absorber of CO2. So if the Amazonian rainforest is cut down or destroyed, then I mean you lose a huge biological sink of CO2 and you'll aggravate climate change. In fact, it's not impossible. One of the tipping points that scientists recognize in the global warming scenario is that the Amazonian rainforest, instead of becoming a net absorber, instead of being a net absorber of CO2, becomes a net emitter. So, I mean, that is a sort of positive feedback mechanism which could be extremely worrying. So there's no divergence about our goals, but she obviously had her own agenda and I couldn't get her to come. I tried Elton John. I turned up at his place in Old Windsor and asked him if he'd like to come, but he was in America. He's in America until the end of May, so he couldn't help.
Robin, the scientists and people like ourselves are the minority. We need to touch the majority, which is the general public, ordinary people on the street, in the tubes, on the trains. I agree with Simon. You know, unfortunately, it is a celebrity because we are a celebrity-mad society, which is most unfortunate. And even the younger generation are a celebrity-mad society, only
Very
focused
true.
on celebrity.
Yeah.
So Elton John would be a perfect, person to lead our campaign. And another point is it not human nature to wait until something is so dire that we move into crisis management and then try to save the planet? So this is what we're all waiting for. It's not dire enough yet. We haven't got to move. We'll manage for the next few years. It's not my problem. But the problem basically is it's our generation, everybody in this room's generation, maybe excluding you slightly, Phoebe, that caused this problem. So we've been born, we've wrecked the planet, and then we die and say to our kids, well, you sort it out.
Mess. Yeah.
That's what I think is going on.
The trouble is that if this generation, with the help of the younger generation, doesn't do something about it, then they won't be able to do anything about it because it will be too late. I mean, you can't suddenly implement measures to mitigate climate change.
Don't you think it's very hard that we've caused the problem, you, me, all of us in this room, and we're leaving it to our children and our grandchildren? This is what I think we need to bring home to everybody. And we need the 99% out there that haven't got a clue about global warming, maybe don't believe it for whatever reasons, to come on board. We need the public with us, not just all the... We've got the scientists, we've got the proof.
Well, it's true. I mean, when Gordon McCarran talked at Windsor about disposal of nuclear waste, he said there is an issue here of intergenerational justice. We have reaped the benefit of running nuclear power stations for decades, and we've got cheap-ish power from it, but we haven't paid the cost because we haven't buried the waste, and it will be left to future generations to deal with that waste, and that is totally unacceptable. So it's the same principle.
Robert, when the American networks bought David Attenborough's Blue Planet series, they bought them all, apart from the very last one, which was the episode on climate change.
Yeah.
Why would that be the case? Why would the networks not want to take the whole series? What's their motivation?
Because they've managed to create an artificial consensus in America that this is not a problem, that it isn't so serious as people say it'll be, and that mankind can adapt to it. That's their basic premise. So they don't want to have to interrupt their lifestyle, their gas-guzzling cars, their huge carbon emissions. They don't want to have to interrupt that because of some possible environmental hazard which will be, decades in the future. That's their sort of basic position. And because the people who run these networks are not scientists, they don't have the intellectual rigor to see through the weakness in their case.
But whoever produced the series should not have allowed it to go out completely finished. Being from series 1 to 8. They should never have sold it on without the entire series if they had any proof.
Yes, that's the point.
If this is my work, it's from 1 to 8, they should have all been sold and accepted by America.
Yeah, but the BBC is run by managers, aren't they? And managers know even less about science than the journalists.
Robin, I think one of the things that we've learnt very much this week is that there is hope of sustainable, renewable energy, And I think somehow or other we need to persuade the Americans that just burning up fossil fuel is not the way ahead, and that we have alternative methods of producing electricity which are environmentally friendly and can be commercially friendly as well.
That's right.
And I think Alan on Tuesday, he talked about solar panels in India, absolutely captivated that. And that's the message we've got to get across to the commercial world, that there's money to be made out of this. And I think that's come over this week, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.